Gracias. Buenos días. Gracias por la invitación de hablar con ustedes. Yo conozco bien esta colección Thyssen porque para mis investigaciones sobre paisaje americano hay muchas pinturas de esta colección que son importantes por las investigaciones, pero esto es la primera vez que yo las veo de verdad. Entonces, estoy muy contenta de hablar sobre esas pinturas con ustedes. Voy a cambiar a inglés para comenzar. So when the celebrated New York landscape painter Frederick Church hosted an open studio in the spring of 1865, critics were struck by his display of two nearly identically sized and visually similar paintings set in vastly different parts of the globe. Here's what a New York Post critic had to say about these paintings. Church has two large pictures on which he is employed. One depicts the rainy season in the tropics with towering mountains half shrouded in rain and mist, and a rainbow hovering over a deep chasm. The other picture is a scene in the Arctic regions with snow-clad hills and icy coast and the fitful rays of the aurora borealis playing in the heavens. That Church would present the tropics and the Arctic together, working on both at the same time, was not an accident, for he again cultivated an affinity between these regions later that year, when critics noted that his newly finished Aurora Borealis painting was exhibited alongside pictures of Cotopaxi and Chimborazo, Ecuadorian volcanic peaks like the one shown in this Thyssen Collection painting. It may seem improbable that a solar phenomenon of polar winter should be reminiscent of the tropics at all. The tropics, characterized by heat, moisture, and fecundity, could not be more different an ecosystem than the Arctic, a region perceived both then and today as cold, brutal, and desolate. In my talk today, I want to suggest otherwise. So I want to suggest that the visual similarities cultivated by Church actually reflected geopolitical understandings of the U.S.'s place in the world during the Civil War era. And moreover, that ice and its material qualities was at the center of such affinities. So I will draw your attention today to 19th century American ice-scapes, or landscapes of ice, painted by Church and his contemporary William Bradford. Here they are. Two artist explorers based in New York City with studios in the same building that you see over there. To depict the Arctic on a large scale in these very detailed large paintings that both of them painted, they each undertook artistic expeditions to Labrador and Greenland between 1859 and 1869, a decade coinciding with a broad national fascination with the northern reaches of the hemisphere. Their ice-scapes not only brought this unfamiliar region of the world to U.S. viewers, but they also helped to generate a global imperialist mindset within the United States, decades before the country actually built its formal insular empire at the close of the century. I want to argue that the strategies of perception used in the Arctic and the technologies of globalization that made temperature portable decisively linked art, ice, and race. When William Bradford painted this painting in 1871 entitled An Arctic Summer Boring Through the Pack in Melville Bay, he underscored the fact that ice-scapes were a subject with global reach. With the inclusion of a tall ship boring through pack ice, as the title tells us, Bradford capitalized on an international scientific obsession of the day, the hunt for the fabled Northwest Passage, the shortest route between Euro-American ports and trade destinations in East and South Asia. Thus, breaking through Arctic ice, which Bradford's ship was showed his ship trying to do, meant clearing a route to the tropics. Looking north meant thinking south. Accounts of the Northwest Passage have circulated since the 16th century, but it was pursued with the greatest fervor in the 19th. A new sea route over North America would have dramatically reduced cost and time in Pacific shipping, which then required ships to round the tip of South America, Cape Horn, in order to get from the Atlantic coast of the United States to any destination in the Pacific. The British were the most ambitious Arctic explorers in the first half of the 19th century, followed by US Americans in the century's second half. Between 1850 and 1910, more than 24 US-based expeditions entered the Arctic Circle. Many traveled under the guise of humanitarianism. Here are a few documents from that period. So humanitarianism, because they were, the intention was to rescue a celebrated British explorer named Sir John Franklin, whose 2 ships and 100 members of his crew had been missing in the Arctic since their own polar expedition of 1845. But in fact, these explorers who were going to look for Franklin were actually very much after the same seafaring route that Franklin had so famously failed to find. Summing up the Anglo-American tradition of Arctic exploration, the US oceanographer named Matthew Maury proclaimed, "Whatever may have been the immediate object of these various expeditions, whether to enlarge fields of commerce, to carry the Bible, to spread civilization, to push conquest, or to bring back contributions of science, it has never lost sight of the promise made by Columbus of a western route to India." The possibility of a Northwest Passage structured 19th century understandings of the Arctic's relationship to the rest of the globe. Dreams of global connectedness without ice emerged in all aspects of culture. In 1826, just after the first of the failed northern expeditions, John Clive Sims, an American trader living in the then frontier town of St. Louis, began publicizing his theory that a hollow inner Earth connected the 2 poles. So he thought that if you went far enough northward, you would be transported through a hollow shaft to the other side of the world. And he elaborated quite a lot about this theory. So while the Earth's hollowness had some mathematical precedent, Sims was the first to propose an actual expedition to explore what he thought was this habitable center inner sphere via the North Pole. As an early American engaged in commerce across distances, he ran an Indian trading post in St. Louis. It is perhaps no surprise that he would turn to the language of globalization when talking about this proposed expedition. So he said that such an expedition he put it, would be an immense advantage to our commerce and national prosperity. So, although it seems really outlandish, the hollow Earth theory had quite a broad national reach. It inspired Edgar Allan Poe's fiction, it was covered by the popular media, and it motivated a government-funded expedition to the South Pole. Meanwhile, less eccentric theories of a habitable northern pole also circulated. Observations of currents, ocean currents, wind direction, and animal migration between the poles and the equatorial regions led scientists to hypothesize that a warm, open sea flowed over the Earth's poles just beyond the ice-jammed subarctic, which had time and again forced explorers to turn back. Matthew Maury, the author of the popular oceanography book that I earlier quoted, theorized that water from the torrid regions traveled north as an undercurrent, pulled below the surface by its density. Once the supposed submarine current reached the pole, it would, he wrote, rise up like a boiling spring in the center of an open sea. Such a geographic scheme, if correct, would reveal a veritable tropics at the cardinal ends of the Earth. Among Maury's most vocal advocates was the polar explorer Isaac Israel Hayes, a figure closely associated with both Church and Bradford. So Church actually was Hayes's drawing teacher for a while in the 1850s, and then later, once Hayes became very famous, he accompanied William Bradford to Greenland as a kind of paid consultant expert. So Hayes is famous for an expedition in 1860 to 61, a major expedition the goal was to find this open polar sea. And shown in this illustration is an illustration from one of his publications, and it imaginatively depicts, the moment when Hayes, on a very high cape, at what he assumed was the northernmost point ever attained by any Euro-American person, he sighted water there, and he proclaimed, "All the evidences show that I stood up on the shores of the polar basin and that the broad ocean lay at my feet." So he was wrong, but he thought he had found the open polar sea. And at this point, which is imaginatively depicted there, he named the highest peak that was visible from that location after Frederick Church, who then went on to feature it in his Aurora Borealis painting. Let's see if I can. This peak right here, Church's Peak. So, in claiming that warm equatorial flows made the frozen north navigable, scientists like Hayes and Maury neatly tied the Arctic to the tropics in a scientific defense of imperial ambitions. Maury summarized his global system of currents, for which he was a pioneer. He was the first to really propose that the entire globe was governed by currents, and he was the first to map most of them. So in his idea of these global currents, he said that there is a constant tendency of polar waters toward the tropics and tropical waters toward the poles, which is in effect an ecological argument for colonialism. A loyal Confederate, after the outbreak of the Civil War, Matthew Maury actually had long favored the establishment of a slave-based empire for the United States in the Amazon basin, since the currents, as you see in this is a map of the Gulf Stream, would have turned the Atlantic seaports of the United States into what he deemed halfway stations to all the markets of the world. While Hayes, the polar explorer, was he was a northerner, and during the Civil War actually ran a Union field hospital. He was a doctor by training. He nevertheless saw his expeditions as an imperialist endeavor. When raising money for his 1860 expedition, he promoted his journey as an effort to ensure that the American flag, and not some other countries, would, as he said, guard the highway to the pole. It is no coincidence that the global shipping of perishable commodities dates to these self-assured decades of Arctic exploration. As Church and Bradford painted the Arctic, the American ice industry was booming. Large-scale harvesters hacked blocks of ice out of frozen lakes and rivers throughout the U.S. Northeast to literally supply the tropics. As a historian of science named Rebecca Woods has argued, cold, when harnessed as a technology and a commodity, cheats time and distance, connects food chains of north and south, temperate zones and tropical latitudes, and colonial imperial metropoles with rural and colonial outposts. The ability to transport temperature is how the tropics became the lifeline of our modern way of life. In the mid-19th century, cold technology revolved around managing the material conditions of ice, keeping it frozen in storage and transport. In the 1830s, ice from the United States became an international commodity shipped as far as India. So in 1856, 146 tons of ice was shipped from Boston to India. Ice companies imagined the global reach of their product from the outset, Before venturing into ice, Frederick Tudor, better known as the Ice King, had worked as a merchant trading colonial goods like spices, sugar, and tea. So it seemed only natural that his first venture in ice involved sending 80 tons of it to Martinique, a project so strange that in 1806, the Boston Gazette had to point out that it was not a joke. Before long, Tudor was offering his investors assurance of his company's, in his words, advance in extending service to all the tropical places. Arctic ice and commodity ice carried shared ambitions in the 19th century. Both of their geographies were bidirectional, linking the frozen north and the tropical south. In the metropolitan Northeast, cities like New York and Boston, where Church and Bradford exhibited their icescapes, viewers likely associated the scenery pictured with the commodity harvested from their own backyards. Accounts of the ice trade evoked landscapes of the Arctic. So in the newspapers, in the media, Tudor, the Ice King, was dubbed the great transporter of icebergs to the torrid regions. And just a side note, at the time it was actually common for sailors, whalers, and people going on these long voyages to trade over the ocean they did store polar ice in ships for drinking water later on. So it's not like outlandish that they would call him this transporter of icebergs. Meanwhile, Church and Bradford digested their own encounters with polar ice through the familiarity of the harvested variety. In a travel account of Church's Labrador expedition, written by the writer Louise Noble, who traveled with him, sea ice is described as akin to, he puts it, our summer cakes handed in by the Iceman. Bradford, meanwhile, depicted actual ice cutting in this etching, which shows a group of men standing on a thick sheet of sea ice using tools to free a channel for several ships awaiting passage. So you can see that happening in the center here. The vignette at the center recalls illustrations about the ice industry that circulated in 19th century newspapers. This 1854 print of ice harvesting in Massachusetts depicts men on a frozen pond wielding long spear-like tools similar to the instruments used in Bradford's scene of the Arctic to break up the scored ice below their feet into rectangular blocks. In his etching, Bradford shows the cleaved ice blocks floating at regular intervals towards the open water beyond the ship's stern. So you can kind of see there's a line of pieces of ice that float down the channel that they've made. And this actually, in my view, recalls a very common practice in the ice trade, in which the harvesters would float large cakes of ice to a central ice house on the shore along purpose-built channels. The irony of these 19th century encounters with ice is that the commodification of winter ice enabled the very transnational connectedness that polar ice geographically hindered. Both quests for a more efficient global commodity circulation were attempts in environmental and material control, the one icing, the other de-icing, we might say. And neither of these ambitions proved easy to realize. Explorers and ice traders underestimated the material assertiveness of ice itself, that in melting it becomes worthless water, and that in freezing it entraps and kills. It took many trials for Tudor, the Ice King, to master transporting ice over thousands of nautical miles. He eventually patented a technique for packing ice, which using what he called non-conducting materials. Even so, the ice industry, on average, lost about 50% of each harvest during storage and transit. Meanwhile, Bradford's scenes of trapped Arctic vessels often highlight the power of ice to lift even the most hulking vessels high above the ground or to smash them to pieces. On what we might call the antifreeze front, 19th century expeditions found neither a warm polar sea nor Sir John Franklin's men safe and sound. They returned only with relics, preserved, of course, under ice and snow, and tales of the lost crew, Franklin's crew, lost expedition resorting to cannibalism, the most dreaded end conceivable in maritime culture. It's just, in recent years, actually, Franklin's ships have been discovered in northern Canada because due to, of course, melting sea ice. So there's a sort of continuation of the story into today. By the opening of the 20th century, Arctic exploration had shifted its focus from searching for open routes to conquering the magnetic pole, and ice harvesting was slowly being replaced by chemical-based compressed air refrigeration, which is what we use now. And with that, the era of managing the material conditions of ice would end. The Arctic may have always been the subject of fascination to those from the temperate world, but the middle decades of the 19th century was unique in that the US national preoccupation with managing ice, whether in melting it or freezing it, shaped the politics of the Arctic icescape. In painting the Arctic, both Bradford and Church were using conventions of landscape painting, the US genre associated with constructing narratives of national progress tied to nature, and you've already heard a little bit about this today. Nowhere is this trope more visible than, I think, in this painting by Asher B. Durand, aptly titled Progress, the Advance of Civilization. Here you see figures that move from foreground to background along a path along the waterside path, which is, of course, flanked by telegraph poles. So first in wagons, then boats, and then in the background in trains, therefore naturalizing a narrative of westward expansion tied to technological innovation and evolution. Expeditionary artists like Church and Bradford played a major role in shaping the genre of landscape in these terms. In the 1860s and 70s, Albert Bierstadt, a friend and mentor of Bradford's, and actually probably the arch rival of Church, who also had a studio in that same building, portrayed newly surveyed portions of the American West in these paintings in the Thyssen Collection. And he portrayed these regions as ideally peaceful and verdant territories for national expansion, despite ongoing conflicts between settlers and indigenous people. The communication of these ideological messages relied on certain pictorial conventions. One of them was the inclusion of an inviting viewpoint from the center of the painting, a kind of middle distance point on which the viewer can sort of pretend to be. And in these paintings, you see there's a kind of warm, inviting space in the center of both compositions, which is actually enhanced by the very atmosphere that envelops it. Both Church and Bradford sought to depict icescapes as if they were these kinds of more familiar terrestrial landscapes. In his most elaborate Arctic scene, called The Icebergs of 1861, Church imagined the composition as in a kind of earthbound terms, borrowed from his depictions of tropical and temperate regions. In a broadside that accompanied this painting's exhibition, Church informed viewers that they are standing at a privileged viewpoint commanding this surrounding space. So he writes, "The spectator is supposed to be standing on the ice. Imagine an amphitheater upon the lower steps of which you stand and see the icy foreground at your feet. Gaze upon the surrounding masses, all united in one beneath the surface of the sea." So this text essentially assures viewers that they are grounded. So they're standing in this place, they have this commanding viewpoint, but simultaneously it also acknowledges the non-terrestrial nature of the surroundings, the fact that everything is just ice and it's surrounded by sea. So you're essentially standing on an iceberg that looks like it's land, but it's made out of ice. To be clear, the entire composition here is a fiction. Church himself never stood on an iceberg like this. While it was typical for Church to create large canvases out of composites of sketches taken from different viewpoints in his travels, a method that is most associated with his most famous work here, The Heart of the Andes, the fiction of the icebergs is unprecedented. None of Church's sketches from Labrador even remotely resemble his final painting. Instead, they depict icebergs, most of them are like this, isolated against blank backgrounds of sea and sky. While rich in textural and geometric details, they float free like frigid islands, dramatically untethered to anything that resembles firm ground. Church's viewers were not fooled. So to us, this painting probably looks excessive, even gaudy, but period critics, despite having so much to look at here, found nothing to see. They lamented the picture's blankness and formlessness. It is difficult to realize that the painting is a representation of nature, said one. Another likened this scene to the day of creation when the earth was without form and void. The fact that this painting has no solid ground whatsoever, despite appearances, was troubling. Mindful of this, a particularly astute critic wrote, "In painting a scene where only water in some of its various forms is represented, many of the ordinary rules of painting are reversed." Facing this same challenge, Bradford turned to other strategies. As the more seasoned Arctic traveler of the two artists, he made not one, like Church, but 7 Arctic journeys. He knew quite well that the icebound Arctic was, as he put it, a complete reversal of the whole order of nature. His visual experience of the Arctic was an ungrounded, oceanic one, closer to the vision shown here in this Thyssen Collection painting than the more dramatic scenes set on ice that became his specialty. Like Church's icebergs, Bradford's more dramatic scenes were largely imagined, composites drawn from an archive of photographs he amassed, taken by professional photographers he hired to join his expeditions. Bradford made a point of infusing his icescapes with narrative, gesturing to the tales told in popular travelogues published by polar explorers of the period. Details such as the just barely visible row of some dozen men tugging this ship in this 1875 painting, so you can see them all right there, literally depicts the human traversal of icy terrain in that critical middle distance of the landscape. Church actually would eventually fall back on this idea of the narrative as well. By adding this detail, this is a mast of a ship that's broken off. He actually added that detail later, so it wasn't part of the original painting that he received all those bad reviews about. So in addition to narrative, Bradford also relied often on warm colors to construct ice in more familiar terrestrial terms. So the golden and red hues of his ice fields and icebergs at sunset and sunrise deflect the problem of blankness that viewers found so troubling in the cooler, unearthly chromatic effects of Church's icebergs. Church and Bradford sought to bring terrestrial strategies of representation to the icescape. Actually, notice there's the identical detail in that painting too. And in the process, they rejected the very material conditions of ice that they experienced firsthand, its volatility and strangeness, its reversal of familiar nature. Despite their best efforts to turn the Arctic into a proper landscape, ice hardly offered the stable and solid ground on which narratives of imagined traversal and possession relied. After all, it was not ice, but the absence of ice that would have constituted progress when it came to conquests of the far north. To make sense of ice, to transform it from a troubling material into a manageable one, they, along with others who traveled to the Arctic, drew upon its resemblance to solid materials of sculpture and architecture. So whereas Church's painting may have been mute to viewers, the text written by his travel companion, Louise Noble, was almost compensatory in its endless stream of metaphors that give ice legibility. So for Noble, ice was anything but ice. It was a combination of Alp, castle, mosque, Parthenon, and cathedral. It has towers, battlements, and portals. It has minarets, domes, and steeples, roofs, gables, balustrades, balconies, frieze, architrave, cornice, arches, cloisters, niches, statuary, and countless decorations. So it goes on and on and on. It's a whole book. Noble's glutted inventory of Baroque associations that are quite tedious was in fact common in 19th century accounts of the Arctic. Bradford turned to similar narratives in his own travelogue, which he published in 1873. Ice, he wrote, gave scope for the imagination to picture forth all things wonderful and strange, whether it be the gigantic form of man and beast, crenellated castle wall, or dungeon keep. Such descriptions focus on chance resemblances, or seeing in, an imaginative or associational mode of perception dating back to antiquity, and most often applied to immaterial substances like clouds and smoke, that they kind of become forms when you look into them. In the Western tradition, seeing in has long been associated with the creative process, even with the birth of art itself. Giambattista Alberti suggested that sculpture began when humans found objects whose appearance needed only a slight change to become the striking imitation of something else. In their metaphor-laden rhetoric, Arctic narratives regularly evoked connections between ice and sculpture, highlighting the chromatic and textural affiliations between marble and frozen water. Bradford described one iceberg that took the form of a human bust, and that was, as he says, perfectly smooth and white as the purest marble, well-proportioned, and as finely rounded by the action of the water as if fashioned by the chisel of a sculptor. And elsewhere he wrote that almost any form could be realized in ice, as if, he's encountering these icebergs as if he himself had that sculptor's chisel in hand. In the 19th century, this mode of perception pervasive in Arctic narratives was aligned not with landscape painting, a genre associated with empirical vision, but with the then popular art form of ideal sculpture, neoclassical marbles depicting literary, historic, and mythical figures. Exhibition pamphlets codified sculptural sight in the mid-19th century as an associational practice, a kind of seeing in, that, as art historian Joy Casson has argued, facilitated the viewer's access to an artwork's narrative content and moral lessons, these being the allegorical content of the work, not the literal material content of the work. So, instructing viewers on proper behavior before Edward Brackett's Shipwrecked Mother and Child, an 1850 work about maritime disaster, the sculptor Horatio Greenough prescribes the following. He says, "Sit quietly on several sides of the room, and even there survey it with half-closed eyes. The work is of marble. It is vain that you will seek aught else by crowding upon it. By remaining at a proper distance, you will find that it is no longer marble, but poetry." In other words, to see beyond the sculpture as a meaningless stony surface, the viewer has to purposefully reduce visual acuity. Surveying artworks from across an open gallery from a distance, viewers of ideal sculpture use precisely the opposite skill they would have needed for looking at landscape painting. Spectators of landscape were instructed instead to not look from afar, but to approach the canvas and to carefully inspect every detail, like a scientist in the field. So Frederick Church is actually believed to have set this precedent by actually encouraging his viewers to bring their opera glasses to his exhibitions, as written here, so that they might actually magnify the botanical details that he was so celebrated for painting. The prototypical 19th century viewer of landscape, then, extracts meaning from the details of the surface, while the viewer of ideal sculpture deduces meaning by completely ignoring surface details. 19th century accounts of the Arctic, which so indulged kind of seeing in associations, evoked not the meticulous inspection of landscape, but the distant and passive gaze of the admirer of sculpture. To see ice as sculpted allegory rather than as frozen water, what it literally is, entangled the Arctic in marble's racial ideologies. 19th century American sculptors invested heavily in marble's natural whiteness because of its embodiment of the ideals of the actual sculpted subjects. So art historian Charmaine Nelson has pointed out that the rejection of color in ideal sculpture inhabited a colonial logic. Sculpture pits the pure, restrained, and noble white body, as seen here in Here Empowers Greek Slave, perhaps the most famous marble sculpture of the 19th century US, against what she calls this kind of sensuous, unruly black body, which was rarely a subject of ideal sculpture, even after emancipation. Seeing with half-closed eyes also favored marble's intangible whiteness, a smooth flawlessness that pushed sculpture toward that kind of poetic abstraction that you were meant to get out of the work. So indeed, when Powers' Greek Slave toured the antebellum South, it was almost universally praised as a portrayal of ideal femininity rather than as in any way related to the US institution of slavery, with which it was associated when it was shown in the North. The icescape cannot be divorced from these contested geographies. When Church first debuted his icebergs in New York less than 2 weeks after the outbreak of the Civil War, he chose a politicized title, The North, Church's picture of icebergs. Only later did he rebrand it with a simpler title that we know today. He further hung it alongside a deliberately patriotic painting, Our Banner in the Sky, in which a fiery sunset forms the stars and stripes of the national flag. The allegorical painting, which was rather atypical for Church, makes clear that seeing in does imbue nature with politics. Church's move here also reinforced an alignment of the Arctic North with the Union and the tropical South with the Confederacy, which emerged also in Arctic exploration narratives. Isaac Hayes described his Polar Sea expedition in 1860 as a mission to carry, in his words, the flag of our republic with not a single star erased from its glorious union to the extreme northern limits of the earth. The Confederate South, meanwhile, was often coded as tropical, particularly in medical literature, where it was described as filled with swamps that bred epidemics. The slave economy in the South also linked the Confederacy with the veritable tropics of the Caribbean and Brazil, and such a link was not just historical, because in the 1850s, Southerners like Matthew Maury, that oceanographer, had tried but failed to realize their dream of a tropical slave empire to the South. In the Civil War era, ice may have been righteously tethered to the Union by Church and by others, but it can hardly be pardoned from problematic racial constructs. Ice was deeply enmeshed in 19th century race science, particularly in the work of Harvard scientist Louis Agassiz, a glaciologist who became one of the 19th century's most notorious champions of white supremacy. The career-making achievement of this Swiss-born Agassiz was his discovery of the Ice Age, on the basis of the movement of glaciers in the Alps and on fossil evidence. Agassiz posited correctly that enormous ice sheets once covered a great part of the temperate regions of the world, though he assumed incorrectly that such environmental change was abrupt. Here's how Agassiz describes it, the Ice Age. A sudden intense winter that was also to last for ages fell upon our globe. It spread over the very countries where tropical animals had their homes, and so suddenly that it come upon them that they were embalmed beneath masses of snow and ice without time even for the decay which follows death. Embedded in Agassiz's imagining of the Ice Age was the idea that certain species were designed to inhabit their unique regions of the globe and that any change in climate would be catastrophic. When Agassiz emigrated to the United States in 1846 to accept a professorship at Harvard, he was deeply disturbed by the multiracial makeup of his new country and soon became a public face of a branch of race science called polygenism. the idea that human races were distinct species and, like animals, would only thrive in their native climates. For him, races of men were no more adaptable than the prehistoric tropical, or so he thought, tropical megafauna that he had found embalmed in snow and ice. Though opposed to slavery, Agassiz still believed that the races should be geographically separated, with blacks contained in quote-unquote Negro communities in the tropical regions. While serving as the founding director of the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology, Agassiz set out to prove through commissioning daguerreotype photographs of racial types, including enslaved individuals, that, quoting him, "The difference existing between the races of men are the same kind as differences between species of monkeys and animals." Certainly, Agassiz's belief in white supremacy maps neatly onto a literal global whiteness of the Great Ice Age, but links between ice and race were much more than just metaphorical. While Agassiz himself never ventured to the Arctic, though he was coincidentally on the same ship that brought Church to Halifax on his way to the Arctic, his ideas on glaciation and race both made their way to the far north. The Arctic was, after all, the origin point of the glaciers that once covered the Earth. So when Isaac Hayes embarked on his 1860 polar expedition, he wrote that one of his objectives was to determine the movement of Arctic glaciers following, as he noted, the efficient plan of Professor Agassiz in his alpine surveys. If the world covered in ice was once a prehistoric reality, then a trip to the Arctic was also thought to be a trip into the past. It was thus not surprising that descriptions of Inuit people assumed them to be, in the words of one expedition doctor in 1873, the quote-unquote nearest blood relative of Paleolithic man. A clergyman by the name of Wasson, who accompanied William Bradford on one of his Labrador journeys in 1864, actually published a series of essays in The Atlantic entitled Ice and the Eskimo, in which he described the Inuits that he encountered as, in his words, a seal come to feet and hands as inseparable from the extreme north as his animal kindred. Wasson, the author, concluded his account with direct reference to Agassiz, noting that while he couldn't affirm the origins of the Inuits, he was inclined to accept Agassiz's hypothesis that they were, quote-unquote, created originally just as they are. So in other words, that they had not adapted to the Arctic environment from some common ancestor of all humans. Agassiz's race science privileged not just the superiority of the white race, but also its mobility, which was not granted to other races. Such mobility was foundational, of course, in the quest for the Northwest Passage, as it was for colonizing the tropics. And polygenists like Agassiz actually thought that white people were unsuited for the tropics and that they would become sick and degenerate once they went there, if not for technology. So the Arctic icescape, both in practice of organizing and executing these expeditions and in imagery of icebreakers and steamships, was a celebration of white mobility enabled by technological ingenuity. In reality, Arctic expeditions relied heavily on the skills and knowledge of indigenous people of the region who often went uncredited for their work. So just to give one example of one of these indigenous people who helped Arctic expeditions. There was an Inuit man named Ibrevik, who was also variously called Ibra Bing, Eskimo Joe, or Joseph, who accompanied at least 4 Arctic expeditions in the 1860s and 70s, often with his wife, Tukuluktuk, who worked as a cook and seamstress. And during the particularly disastrous trip led by Charles Francis Hall, who actually was murdered while he was in the Arctic by one of his shipmates, Ibrevik Tukuluktuk and other Inuit families employed by Hall kept a group of castaways from this expedition alive for 6 months after they were set adrift on an ice island with no vessel and limited provisions. The myth of white mobility and technical ingenuity was also central to the trade in commodity ice. In its circulation, ice was colonizing material quite literally. Based in the northern US states, the industry's largest international markets were tropical colonies with large white populations, the Caribbean and India. There, ice was a luxury meant for the colonizer class, where it was used almost exclusively to cool drinks, since tropical heat, as it was thought, was physiologically unfit for white bodies. In India, only British colonists with enough money to hire servants would have been able to afford to buy ice. Ice was also perceived as incompatible with those native to tropical climates. In this 19th century print showing ice being unloaded in Cuba from the holds of a ship marked Maine, which was actually known at the time for yielding a state that yielded particularly transparent, thus pure ice, Black enslaved laborers are shown unable to tolerate the extreme temperatures of the imported blocks. The food historian Ile Hobart has also argued that indigenous Hawaiian accounts of ice as burning or too hot instead of cold, freezing, was interpreted by colonists there as a marker of biological racial difference. The circulation of ice, which both defined and justified racial disparity in the colonial tropics, as you see here, was reliant also on an exploitation and consumption of non-white labor. The tropics and the Arctic were both opposite and continuous spaces in the 19th century US imagination. Both were spaces of colonial ambition where nature was potent and aggressive. Whereas the tropics required plantations and slave labor to manage its heat and fecundity, the Arctic, with its ice-jammed waters, required controlling a different kind of materiality. US imperialist ambitions, both on ice in the Arctic and with ice in the tropical marketplace, relied on a technological control of melting, whether enabling it or preventing it. The icescapes of Bradford and Church brought together these encounters with ice, along with their imperialist meanings and racial dimensions. Geologically, ethnographically, and economically, these paintings were embedded in discourses on race and empire that extended from pole to equator. Thank you. Gracias.
Gracias, Maggie, por esa presentación. Thank you. Y de nuevo tenemos tiempo para hacer preguntas o algún comentario, así que voy a abrir el espacio para esas cuestiones.
Bueno, ha sido una ponencia magnífica, muchísimas gracias. Una preparación, muchísimas ideas absolutamente fecundas y bien traídas, me ha encantado. En fin, es una pregunta muy sencillita. Me ha fascinado un detalle que ha hablado sobre hablando de las dos partes en la guerra civil de Estados Unidos, la cuestión norte-sur y la cuestión de tropical, zonas heladas o árticas. ¿Puede aclarar un poquito? Que no he acabado de entender la conexión.
Yes, thank you. Yes, so the connection is that so both in terms of the artists had this connection, but also it was a more general connection because during the Civil War period, many Americans were going to the north, to the Arctic to explore, but at the same time, they were actually also going south to explore the tropics in the Caribbean and Central America, in South America. And the connection is that during the Civil War, one way that Americans thought to emphasize the difference between North and South of the United States was through climate. So this idea that the North is like this temperate, cooler region, the South is this hot, tropical climate. And because of that differentiation, there was an association of the North with the Arctic, where people were going in the United States, and the South with the tropics. The tropical connection, a lot of it came out of medicine. So tropical medicine, this idea that like we have today, there's like a specialty of tropical medicine, that emerges in the mid-19th century, especially because it was sort of the idea of tropical medicine was conceived in the north, in the northeast, this kind of cosmopolitan Northeast, where they were sort of studying all these tropical diseases like malaria and everything that were endemic to the South, not just to the tropics, but to the southern US. And so there was this lumping together of the south of the US with places further south. And then for the North, it really comes out of this church, actually, was one of these church, Hayes, these people who were invested in the Arctic, started talking about the North in this generic way. So that during the Civil War, when people said the North, it was about the Union, but it was also about, the North of the whole hemisphere. So it was sort of I don't think that people thought necessarily that, the Arctic was supporting the Union cause or something, but that the people supporting the Union cause really thought of the Arctic as part of what they said, what they called the North. Yes? Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. Any other questions? Then, Carl. Well, actually, I had a thought for you, so maybe I can pose it, and then you can reply with whatever you had to ask. So, I was thinking about your Shinnecock Hills painting that you would like to take in the suitcase with you at the end of this symposium. So I was thinking about that painting and at how empty that landscape is, but also the several other landscapes that you showed that Chase is painting in that place, and of how speculative the whole venture seems, right? That he goes to this place because there was a commercial interest to develop the area, and at how he refuses to show this development. But he also refuses to show what was there before because there's no indigenous presence in his paintings either. So in this atemporality, if you want it, as you were mentioning, but I was curious if you could elaborate a bit more on the speculative character of the painting and in this interest in showing this point in time that doesn't really reflect the development that was happening at the time.
Thanks. I don't know that I can. That's a really interesting comment, and one I hadn't considered, that he's showing a kind of absence. I made the point about the Native American presence, which is, excised from all of his works. But you're right, he's also not showing what sort of replaces it, which is the development that you're talking about. And that's interesting because it's also, of course, political, and that he doesn't show that.
And also that he was thinking about this indigenous presence, because you said that the middle name of his daughter was an indigenous word, right? You mentioned.
Yeah. So in a way, I guess it's sort of two sides of the same coin, maybe, where you have a willful absence. This is kind of about nothing aesthetic, which removes both anything sort of potentially malign from the painting, the Native American presence on the one hand, and the sort of ravages of progress and development on the other. But that's a really interesting question, so thanks.
Sure.
Maggie, if I might, my question for you, and it was a wonderful presentation, really enjoyed listening to it, thank you. I was just wondering, it's great that these paintings are up on the screen still. I was wondering about I was thinking about ice, water and ice, and then paint and dried paint. And, the transformation of sort of material medium from one to the other. And there's sort of a parallel, perhaps, in that. And I just wondered, was that something that was anywhere in anything that you've seen from, it maybe not in 19th century art criticism, but it just was interesting that you spoke, really compellingly about the ways that critics responded to the icebergs as troubling because it sort of, in a sense, depicted nothing fixed. It was, and in a way, that's what an artist is doing with taking viscous, immaterial or not fixed paint and then applying it through their sort of vision and making something fixed and permanent out of it. And I just wondered if that was anything that anything like that ever sort of came out of any of the research you've done in terms of the way people were thinking about these paintings.
I have not found anything like that, but it's a really, I've not found anything like that in relation to ice. But it's certainly this idea of the material of art and its relationship to the subject of art is in the discourse of the period. So like where I have seen it, which is not part of this work that I'm doing on ice, but on another kind of related research about sort of oceans, is that watercolor. People did talk about watercolor and the medium of water being used in watercolor, and to me that seems really relevant to depictions of the ocean using watercolor, so water representing water. In terms of this project, the closest thing I can say is that actually not that it was in the discourse of the time, but I showed that print by Bradford of the ice channel being cut, and Bradford wasn't really a printmaker, but he did make a few prints, and that was one of them. And I think there's a real material connection between the subject and the medium. So the medium is etching. So he's, literally cutting into, a material, the surface of metal in order to produce that image. And in that print, he's also depicting using metal tools to cut into a surface, right? So it's kind of the opposite, what you're saying, because he's really emphasizing the solidity of ice in that particular image, thinking of it as something you have to hack into, have to remove, like this very terrestrial kind of action. And he's doing that through a medium in which he's literally having to cut into metal, right, which is a hard surface. And in fact, there's a painting on which that print is based. So he did the painting. There's like a big painting. He did the painting first, and then he turned it into a print. And in the painting, there's less emphasis on the cutting of the ice. Like they're still doing it, but there's fewer kind of blocks of ice that are floating away. So to me, that seems like a really material connection between the medium and the subject matter.